Let's go ahead and begin. Thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar today. We're going to be learning about energy storage and focusing, I think, specifically on some of the activity here in the United States. But our participants are joining us from across the world, so hopefully as we move into the discussion, we'll have some comments and some feedback from our participants that will help bridge that dialogue and share some of the nuances of how energy storage is being considered and deployed in different parts of the world, and we can get into an interesting conversation there. I'm just going to begin with a couple housekeeping notes and a little bit of context about our international program before I turn things over to our presenter. For those that maybe are slightly less familiar with EEI and its international programs and our membership, we have 68 members that are outside of the United States in other countries. Regionally, you can see on this map that there's a fair amount of balance between different regions, which is fantastic for these types of discussions where we can really see what is going on with a particular technology and what are some of the lessons learned that can be applied to other parts of the world. Given the timing of this call today, I think most of our registered member participants are in North America and Europe. But we do have members in other parts of the world, and we will make this available as a recording for them. Just a little bit about EEI's international programs. We support dialogue among the industry, outreach on behalf of our members to the broader stakeholder community. We support our members by promoting the interesting things that they're doing and by conducting analysis for their benefit. And so what we're doing here today sort of bridges two of these services. This webinar will be an opportunity for you to hear from one of our staff members and to hear some of the contents of a recent white paper that EEI has produced on energy storage. Also, just to flag for this group, we have a really busy fall of webinars planned, almost one a week from now until the end of the year. And we are moving to a system of notifying our members of these webinars where we will be providing a monthly newsletter that will have all of the information for the month ahead, including all of the registration links. So if you are interested in those opportunities, stay tuned for that communication, and you will be able to click on the links within that newsletter in order to register for future ones. And we encourage you to do that and also to circulate it to other people at your company who may be interested in participating. Lastly, just some housekeeping notes. I already mentioned the dial-in instructions if you've just joined now. In order to participate in the discussion at the end, you'll need to dial in by phone, and you can find those instructions on the meeting information tab of this webinar. You can also submit questions via chat, and we are recording this, and we'll make it available to our members at a future point in time. And so, you know, without any further ado, I'll just introduce our presenter, Dr. Lola Infante, who's the Senior Director for our Generation Fuels and Market Analysis team here at EEI. She's going to be leading us through an overview of energy storage, how it's being used, and what are some of the policy and regulatory considerations on most people's minds here in the United States. But as I mentioned, this really is a global topic. You know, even though deployment of storage today is concentrated in a select few markets, I think interest in storage is really ubiquitous. And forecasts of the market for storage globally are extremely bullish. I think the latest estimate from the IEA is that storage is expected to grow 40% year over year for the next decade, from about 2 gigawatts deployed globally today to over 80 gigawatts 10 years from now. So significant growth is expected in storage, not just at the transmission and distribution level, but also behind the meter as well as in off-grid efforts. And that growth is being driven by a wide variety of reasons, from a desire to grow, to manage the growth in variable renewables, efforts to reduce emissions, needs for grid expansion and new infrastructure, as well as improvements in grid resilience. So with that, I'm going to turn control of our webinar over to Lola, and we'll be off and running.
Thank you, Daniel. I think I do have control over the program here. So again, good morning, afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this topic with you all. I think Daniel gave you guys a very good intro and summary, essentially, of what I'm going to discuss later today. But again, I think this is a very important topic, and as Daniel was saying, I am looking forward to some discussion at the end. I think that's the idea of this webinar, is to see if there's ways in which we can help each other and share experiences and insights. So I'm really looking forward to chatting with you after my presentation. So before we jump in straight into the core of the topic, let me please start by giving you some context about the United States, so you get a better sense of where energy storage fits in its industry and policy context. Like many parts of the world, the United States is undergoing a transformation in the way energy is used and produced. With advancements in technology, Americans are using electricity in more ways than ever, and that is the same in most parts of the country, if not all parts of the world, I mean. Our customers expect the industry to be at the center of this transformation and to deliver the energy future that they want while maintaining the reliability and affordability that they also expect. That is really still the core of our business here in the U.S. A relatively recent poll by EEI shows that 7 out of 10 customers in the U.S. want clean energy. The same, I'm assuming, close to the same 7 out of 10 customers also want innovative energy solutions, and they also want an energy grid that is more dynamic and more secure. So with all that in mind, the U.S. power sector is working to meet those changing expectations and to deliver clean energy for everyone. And this is really how we're doing that. So EEI's member companies provide electricity for 220 million Americans. This sounds like an advertisement for EEI, but I think it's important to put this in context. It's not an ad about EEI. At least not a gratuitous ad. It really shows how important the electric power industry is within in the United States in its role of pushing new technologies forward. So the EEI members provide electricity for 220 million Americans. That's almost 70% of electric customers in the country. Companies operate in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, and directly and indirectly create jobs for more than 1 million Americans, and if we add some induced jobs, that's up to 7 million. So like in your countries, I'm sure the electric power industry is the most capital intensive in the country. It plans to invest more than, actually in 2016, I think it invested around $120 billion to build smarter energy infrastructure, and the forecast is that it will build $100 billion or more. It will spend $100 billion or more in CapEx in the next few years on average. So again, the level of investment today is more than twice than it was a decade ago. That is very significant. The industry is clearly investing more and more in transmission and distribution assets as it delivers more renewable energy and other sources to customers and strengthens the reliability and the resilience of the grid. So while the electricity use has increased, the industry's emissions have decreased. That is another important trend to keep in mind. The industry's CO2 emissions are nearly 21% below 2005 levels. And this is because of environmental policies, of course, but also because our generation mix has changed dramatically over the years, and the share of coal fundamentally has been declining steadily, again, in the last 10 years and more. In 2016, it was the first time ever that coal was not the primary fuel for generation in this country. Gas became the most used fuel in the power industry, and this is, of course, due to the shale revolution in 2008, 2009. That is a little bit specific to the U.S., and again, another topic for another webinar another time. But there's many reasons for that. Not all of them are policy-driven. So this new mix results in that almost 1/3 of the U.S. energy mix comes from emissions-free resources, renewables, and nuclear. And again, just a reminder that electric companies in the U.S. utilities are the largest investors in renewable energy in the U.S., with virtually all of the wind, geothermal, hydro in the country, and most of the solar, they are provided by utilities. Let's see. So again, just let me reiterate our commitment to renewable energy and new technologies. Almost half of all new electricity generation capacity added in recent years was renewable energy. The Energy Information Administration, which is the energy statistical branch of the government here, estimates that electricity output from renewable energy will nearly quadruple between 2010 and 2040. That is very significant, and again, not necessarily unique to the United States, but it's definitely happening here as well. Another very important and somewhat related trend is the evolution of the distribution system, and that's something that is being discussed very widely, I know, in other parts of the world as well. With the evolution of our electricity mix, we're also seeing a very rapid deployment of distributed energy resources, solar PV in particular, rooftop solar, but not exclusively. So these are bringing about some changes in the grid that are requiring that electric companies continue to invest in the distribution grid and continue to modernize it and continue to advance that way so we can integrate and accommodate more of those resources. So clearly, the distributed energy resources and the push for the transformation of the industry can bring challenges, and again, we can talk about that, but also they bring opportunities, and here at EEI, we call these smart energy infrastructure, and they really include things like energy storage, of course, but also microgrids, electrification of the transportation system, but in general, more specifically in general, and the more fluid concept of smart cities or smart communities, which of course aims at including all of those other technologies in a more systematic and organized way within that community. So these are important initiatives and important trends that we're seeing in the country as well. So we see this smart energy infrastructure, which again, once we include the technologies and the regulatory changes that they bring about, some people call that grid modernization, smart grids. There's a lot of different definitions and vocabulary that apply to this phenomenon, I should say. I don't know if phenomenon is the right word, but I think you know what I mean here. So here at EEI, we call all that evolution and combination of technologies and regulatory changes smart energy infrastructure. So again, all these, they do provide, even though they come with some challenges, they do provide benefits for the industry, and you can see here some: enhanced reliability, increased resilience, potentially reduced emissions, the creation of a more responsive platform, empower customers. All those we see as potentially very important benefits for the industry. And again, this is a little bit of what I said before. The industry is investing very large amounts in the grid. the distribution system, but also the transmission system. We see the grid on both sides, the transmission distribution, as really the backbone of our economy, the one thing that will enable everything else, from residential solar to, iPhones and everything in between. That we are trying to make it very clear to our policymakers that really very little can happen without a very robust electric grid. And this is really the context where energy storage comes in. I'm sorry I took 10 minutes of your time or so for this, but I think it's important to see where all this fits in together in the United States. So in general, in the country, we're seeing energy storage as a very useful and flexible technology that can be deployed in all parts of the grid, has applications in all parts of the value chain, has benefits for customers and electric companies alike. Which is probably why actually it is one of those resources and technologies that enjoys wide support from pretty much everybody, from all sides of the political spectrum to all types of customers and all types of electric industry stakeholders, electric companies, utilities, third parties, IPPs. Pretty much everybody is on board with trying to promote and help energy storage be deployed in the U.S., which makes our job somewhat easier. So here I'm not telling you anything that you don't know already. I'm sure energy storage can be used in front of the meter, such as to provide ancillary services like frequency regulation or help integrate renewable energy, and can also be deployed at the distribution level at the substation, for instance, or even behind the meter in a standalone application or a microgrid, for example, and Daniel outlined some of those in his introduction. So it's a very flexible resource that can be useful in many different places across the grid. So what we have noticed is that this really is a great opportunity for electric companies, and it really is being deployed all throughout the country by all sorts of companies. A recent forecast by, recent February of this year, Morgan Stanley, for example, outlined a future where by 2019-2020, and I'm quoting here, energy storage market will be around $30 billion, with utilities leading the way in deployment, given their ability to factor in collective customer benefits and deploy storage at scale, which drives down costs. That was an important quote. The report also points out that if rules are changed that allow utilities to deploy storage devices in regulated and competitive markets, and we can talk about that in a little bit, the market will grow an additional 70% over business as usual case. That does represent quite a bit of an opportunity for utilities in the United States. So here at EEI, we want to ensure that electric companies, that our member companies continue to drive the deployment of storage, and that they are able to maximize storage deployment and all of its benefits. So utilities, again, I think it's important to know that we are by far the largest operators. We have always been, and the forecasts are such that they continue to foresee utilities driving the growth of the energy storage market. That is actually important in some of the policy conversations we're having. We continue to be the single largest type of customers for energy storage technologies, and that doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon. So again, even though most of what we read is about batteries, I think it's very important to recognize, at least in the context of the United States, that energy storage is not only about batteries. Actually, hydro pump storage represents over 90% of all of the energy storage that is currently installed in the U.S. That is a lot. So the new projects in batteries in particular are really representing a smaller part, even a very rapidly growing one. But even then, I think also it's important to recognize that thermal storage is also being deployed along with battery, even though, again, most of the articles we see in the trade press and the policy conversations really apply or relate to batteries. These other technologies are also there, and they're incredibly popular. So again, it's not all about batteries, and it's not all about Hawaii or California, which again, they tend to be in the news more than other parts of the country. I just showing you these maps so you get a sense that pretty much everybody in all regions of the country are developing energy storage projects. Just as a side note, if you want more information, there is a public database by the Department of Energy. That is, there's a link. I can ask Daniel to send that to you guys if you're interested. It's an open database with pretty much information about all of the projects, storage and microgrid projects in the United States, and it also has some international projects, North America and the rest of the world. So I think that can be a very interesting resource for everybody. It gives just the name, the owner, some information about financing, the different applications and primary uses for the storage project. So it can be a very useful tool. Just as another FYI, here at EEI, we're working on a brochure book type thing where we will be highlighting some of those projects specifically. We're working on that. I don't have a date on when we will publish that, but that also will provide information, specific information about some of those projects, and will highlight relatively important things for us, like, again, what do they do, how did they came about, whether they were able to solve regulatory issues, and how, that type of thing. So, as I said before, utilities do see storage as a very important tool, but just another tool, not the one tool, not the only tool, another tool in the toolbox. And they're deploying it for many reasons. I am not sure that this map is still very current, but it doesn't really matter. I think the point is to show that, again, energy storage is being deployed all throughout the country, as I mentioned before, which speaks to how versatile it is, and it is being deployed for different reasons. So, for instance, in California, we've seen one of the main drivers being the need to provide capacity and to help integrate renewable energy in the PJM, MISO area, which are, of course, regions with competitive wholesale markets. Batteries are used to provide frequency response in particular, but of course not exclusively. And in the Northeast, we're seeing a lot of discussion and activity surrounding resilience and reliability, and resilience in particular, and as well as congestion. But the resilience issue, it's important in that area because after the Hurricane Sandy a few years ago, all those issues about recovery were very important. And of course, right now in the U.S., the context and news matters a lot, and the latest series of hurricanes, Irma, Harvey, and Maria, are bringing some of those conversations back in vogue, where the importance of having a resilient grid and energy storage being probably being part of that set of solutions, not necessarily in distributed applications. And again, I would love to discuss that with you as well if that's something that you want to, but in more grid applications, trying to bring the grid back up when necessary or when it's done. So again, despite all those opportunities that storage provides the electric power sector, we also, of course, see some barriers to greater adoption. Cost, of course, is an important one. New batteries in particular are still very pricey relative to other alternatives, and although the prices are coming down rapidly, again, they're still pretty pricey. Technical performance, I don't mean that we don't know how energy storage performs, but that we lack the experience, or at least the sharing of the information about that experience and how batteries perform. So I think as we build more of these devices, we operate more of these devices, we share more of the experience, how they evolve and perform over time, more of that data is shared, that little piece of barrier will be removed. But as of now, there's some questions about that. So it's more difficult to make the case to a regulator when we're not 100% comfortable about what these devices might do in 5 or 7 years. Of course, EEI, World Policy Association, and we see the biggest barrier to relate to regulation and policies, specifically when it comes to defining energy storage, the rules about who can and cannot own these devices. So we can talk about it later a bit more, but let me very briefly discuss the ownership issue just because it's at the top of our priorities at EEI, and I think I'll come back to it in a couple of slides. But the U.S., and you all know this, has a somewhat hybrid system where we have in some areas of the country vertically integrated companies, and in other areas of the country restructured companies with wholesale markets, competitive wholesale markets, and in those areas the electric utilities were asked to divest their generation assets. So in that context, which is very similar to the European context, utilities are not allowed to own generation assets because of the way that the energy storage market was once upon a time, that it was dominated by pumped hydro. Energy storage is really defined in many areas as a generation resource, so it ensures that utilities are not allowed to own energy storage, which again, that can be a problem as we discussed before. Energy storage is not necessarily used as a generation asset, but essentially a T&D asset. So that is a significant barrier as far as we're concerned. Cost, I mentioned it very briefly before, so of course cost is an obvious barrier like in any other technology or resource. But it has more wrinkles than just that. The cost issue is further complicated because of the economic viability of energy storage that really depends on the way its value is calculated and the way its services are compensated, given that it's flexible and it can provide many different services at the same time or participate in different markets at the same time. So given that, it can also capture several revenue streams, right? So it's difficult to compare to other resources. The regular levelized cost of energy doesn't really apply. So what we're seeing in the U.S. is that it's relatively difficult to integrate energy storage in IRPs or ask for cost recovery sometimes because it's not just that the batteries or the other devices are more expensive. It's very difficult to make the case and compare to their other alternatives. So that's also something that we need to work on a little bit more. And of course, this also brings up the issue of ensuring that storage can participate in the different markets so it can capture those different revenues. It really is the way to improve the cost structure and at the end of the day, the way to lower costs to consumers of this resource. So let me turn it over to some policy issues very briefly. I think it's important to note here the amount of activity, and then in a couple of slides you'll see that, but also the number of different agencies, essentially, different levels of decision-making and stakeholders that are participating in the energy storage policy-making process in the U.S. So this slide, the first one is already old. I mean, they're all a little old. This is how fast things are moving here. So, of course, the federal government is not moving very fast in the United States recently in the last few years. Another topic for another webinar. Maybe not an EEI webinar, but another webinar. But there's different ways in which they can do things, right? They can provide incentives, spend some more money on R&D or reroute the R&D, that type of thing. There's actually a few proposals, bills in Congress right now that at least one of them aims at facilitating pilot and demonstration projects, which can be a very good way to start accumulating that experience that I was discussing before from utilities and able to share. FERC is very active. Again, I won't go into the details about the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. For those of you that don't know, FERC is the federal regulator of the electric industry. There's been some political issues, so they've been inactive essentially for a few months because they didn't have enough commissioners in there to pass policies and regulations, but now they're back in business. But despite that little hiatus in there this year, they've been really being very active and expected to continue to be very active, trying to change market rules so that storage can participate, as I was saying before, in all of the markets on a comparable basis with other resources. And again, this is at the wholesale level. So throughout the process, with some details needing to be revisited, EEI, we've generally been very supportive of FERC's proposals that allow electric storage resources to participate in the wholesale markets on a non-discriminatory basis with other resources. The last proposal that FERC had on storage, which I just mentioned last November, it also included a portion on the aggregation of distributed energy resources. It's not necessarily linked to storage, but they put both together. And again, that thing belongs in a different, broader conversation about distributed resources. But let me just tell you that there's a whole suite of problems associated with that, from technical issues about metering and grid operations management to just much broader issues about how do we really coordinate between the distribution system and the transmission system. And then there's, of course, this is a complicated system, so what are the jurisdictional authority lines between one and the other? So that's, again, it's not germane to energy storage, but it's something that came in the same proposed rule, so we'll be looking into that at EEI. Again, it's another very interesting topic that some of you may be interested in, so it might be a topic for another webinar at this conversation. And then, of course, we've got the ISOs and the RTOs, and they are doing, and that is the market operators, system operators. They're doing a lot in the space. For example, they're working on developing new products and services that will better accommodate storage. This is not my area of expertise, but I know there are a lot of RTOs that are working to create new products for frequency response, which is, again, it's one of those ways in which we can facilitate the deployment of energy storage. And of course, there's increasingly activity in the states, in all 50 states. Now I'm going to turn over to that in a little, now for a few minutes. So this map shows where there is energy, so where there's policy enacted that is explicitly tackling energy storage at some level. You can see there's not much in terms of inaction. It's not like a renewable energy portfolio standard or mandate that we would have almost in all of the states. But it's a relatively new issue in the United States, so there hasn't been much enacted, but we're tracking that very closely to see where things stand. Let's say that. So the fact that there's not much enacted in the books doesn't mean that there's no activity, and I think these maps show you that there's actually a lot of activity in energy storage in the United States right now. These maps are just an example of where there is activity in the country. So from March, from a couple months during the summer, from September, a lot of that activity happens in the same states over and over again, but then there's some states that have some activity. So we track what's going on. Also, there are many states that have some type of new legislative, regulatory activity. It really happens everywhere. And we're beginning to identify some trends when it comes to this, some new issues. So for instance, we're seeing there's a lot of interest in policymakers in the states in the U.S. on how do we treat storage from the regulatory point of view. You know, again, going back to the ownership and classification issue, there is a lot of interest in how we treat energy storage from the economic point of view. And there's a lot of discussions about integrated resource plannings, requests for proposals. How do we do that? How do we quantify and value those value streams, which is a little bit of what I was telling you about before when I was discussing the costs and how to tackle that. There is some activity on imposing or proposing targets and incentives specifically targeted to energy storage. And we see that as something that will probably continue in the next few months and years going forward. And then there's, of course, there's a lot of other larger themes of grid mod or smart energy infrastructure related activities that, of course, include energy storage, and those tend to look at more than just that. They're a little bit more comprehensive and look at not a complete necessarily, but a bigger reshuffle or restructuring of the industry in the states where they're discussing that. So regulators and policymakers are very engaged in the United States on these issues. And again, we're taking advantage of that opportunity to engage our stakeholders overall and educate them early on the issues that we care about. We say we have a good story to tell. That's what we're trying to do, which brings me to the paper, which I think it's Daniel's original invitation was about to talk about the paper. So we released the paper last spring. It includes all the topics that I just mentioned and discussed. I will not go over them again, as well as some policy recommendations. Very briefly, let me talk about some of the background for the paper, which I think you might find interesting, how it came about. And about 2 years ago at EEI, we started focusing on energy storage a little bit more or more systematically, and we thought that it was important to get consensus around some general ideas that we could share with policymakers, as I was saying before. We wanted to start educating them. So out of those conversations we started having with member companies, it became very clear that electric companies thought that energy storage presented a great opportunity for the electric grid and for consumers alike, and that we had to identify existing barriers so we could begin to address them and work towards lowering or removing them altogether. So we all worked together to create a set of policy recommendations and a short and simple white paper that would help explain those recommendations and our 1,000-foot view of energy storage and how it fits in the electric landscape, which is essentially what I just went through. So I'm not going to tell you what we have in the paper because that's essentially what I was just discussing. So again, we took that to as a way to educate our I'm trying to go a little quick so we have time to chat. I'm looking at the clock here. So it was important for us to make the point that energy storage has many benefits. So we made that. We also stressed the point that electric companies see energy storage as an important tool. We thought it useful to describe some of the technologies. Some of them are too new, and many policymakers didn't really know what they were, how they work. Same goes for the type of applications that energy storage has. There's still a lot of legislators in particular that really don't understand how these devices work or the type of services that they can provide to the grid. So all those conversations brought us to the barriers, you know, as I was mentioning before, the cost, the lack of knowledge on the technical performance, as I was discussing, and then the ownership and classification issues, which have become really at the top of our list. So after that, we created a set of policy recommendations or a set of principles, if you want. We don't like talking about principles, so we call them recommendations in case we need to change them. So they are an important piece, I think, is that this paper and these recommendations are consensus-based. So essentially all of EEI, core EEI member companies agreed with the language in that paper, which has made it a very useful tool for them to be able to educate policymakers and just share with different stakeholders. So again, some of the, let me see, so some of the recommendations I think are maybe important to point out. So again, the ability to own is a very important one for all utilities, regardless of regulatory model. And this goes to, of course, the restructured utilities that are not allowed to own generation assets. But quite frankly, it also goes to the regulated, vertically integrated companies that in theory are allowed to own any type of asset they want. But what we're seeing in the United States, and I don't know whether you're seeing that in your countries, is the push against having utilities expand their assets at the distribution level. So essentially everything, there's a push for having competition in the what it's more and more called distribution energy resources, distributed energy resources into that market. There's a larger and larger group of stakeholders saying that utilities should be out of that market. They should provide the platform so those resources can be like plugged in, but get out of the business. So energy storage, to the extent that it wants to be deployed at the distribution level, even in a vertically integrated world, can also face those type of negative responses for ownership by utilities. So of course, because of the cost issues that we discussed, the recognition of flexibility is very important. That is what it really allows energy storage to participate in the different markets and to capture those revenues. It goes into the provision of multiple services. It's the same concept all over again. And again, we are at EEI, I'm sure you're aware, very focused on rate design and regulatory approaches to how to integrate or not distributed energy resources, rooftop solar in particular. So we have some general recommendations on that. So to the extent that we're talking, or someone, a policymaker, is talking about deploying energy storage at the distribution level like other distributed energy resources, we made the point that energy storage is no different, that whatever applies to other distributed resources in terms of good planning or good rate design should also apply to energy storage, avoiding cost shifting, maximizing visibility, trying to encourage optimal location, those types of things. So again, happy to answer any questions you may have on the paper. So with that, I'm gonna stop so we have some time to answer questions and chat, and I would love to hear your thoughts on whether you see the same type of issues in your part of the world, if you're facing the same type of challenges. So I think, as Daniel was saying at the very beginning, any insights on how to go about these issues that you may have would be very, very useful for us, or if you know about any examples or research that can help us with these priorities, I think that would be awesome. So again, just Daniel, I'll turn it over to you and the audience for questions and debate.
Thanks, Lola. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and maybe ask a leading question while we gear it up to open it up for discussion for those that want to chime in. I've had a couple questions also come in by chat, and so for folks who are in the webinar, just a reminder, you can continue to send those to me if you want me to ask them on your behalf. But to get us started, Lola, I wanted to see if you could take us back to the slide that you had on policy recommendations, the first one, and you listed there the importance that regulatory measures consider and recognize flexibility of various types of energy storage. And this is highlighted in your paper, and you also had it on a previous slide about how some of the areas that need to be addressed for storage to have regulatory cover is to for it to be classified appropriately and for flexibility to be addressed correctly. Could you maybe just provide a little bit more information about what some of those challenges are related to flexibility and classification?
Yeah, I think, again, I think you mentioned most of them in your question itself. I think it's complicated. I think what we're promoting is easy. Implementation of it is not as easy. So energy storage has the advantage of being able to provide many different services, right? I'm not an engineer. Maybe some of you on the call are, but my understanding is that, you know, by being able to charge and discharge, energy storage can really operate as load. It can operate or not operate as, but support different types of operations for the grid, like the generation function, the transmission function, distribution, and again, even load when it charges. That makes it that we can use it in many different parts of the system, and at the same time, essentially, right, depending on how those devices are designed and built, they can do more than one thing. The problem with markets sometimes is that the way they're built, if you are one thing, you cannot do something else. So if you are, and again, I think this is something that is being changed as we speak in wholesale markets in the U.S., but for instance, if you are, let me see how I want to say this, a transmission and distribution asset because of classified or recognized as a T&D asset because your main primary function is going to be to support that transmission function, then you cannot really participate in the energy market. So you're precluded from doing that. I think FERC actually solved that a few months ago with the policy statement saying you can actually do that. The issue right now, so you can, even if you're a transmission helping type of asset, you can also participate in the energy market. But there's issues of compensation because each of the two types of assets get complicated, or functions or services get compensated differently in those markets. The energy functions and services are compensated based on market prices and the wholesale market. The T&D functions, such as the transmission functions, are cost of service. They're regulated by FERC. It's a different thing. So how we operationalize that in terms of compensation is difficult, even though in principle we all agree. So again, it's recognizing that flexibility so we can start addressing the issue. I think that's the important piece. Another example for that is at the distribution level, right? And that I think the issues are also compensation, but also like technical type of things, you know, particularly if we're talking about smaller resources and aggregation of those. I think the issues just become really complicated. A little bit the same type of conversation we had with demand response, where it's like, okay, can I count on all these resources? Will it be there? But demand response does not transfer electrons through the distribution system, so actually storage provides the same concerns in terms of will the resources be there? Will they really avoid other investments? And then the additional problem of how are the actual electrons, how is the distribution system going to be affected if I'm using distributed resources for transmission functions, for instance, that type of thing. So I think, again, in principle, we need to recognize that storage can, if we design it properly, provide different, it is very flexible, I can provide different types of services, but we need to be cognizant that, you know, there may be issues, but I think that's the problem. Or the issue is there. Let's try to, once we have that recognition, we can start working towards solving the problems. Long-winded answer, I'm sorry.
Yeah, provision of different services and multiple services simultaneously, I think that's a really key point. There's been a lot of estimates of the value from solar that depends on the ability to stack those services on top of each other in order to really maximize their value. I think that's a really important point. Okay, we're going to try this now to see if it will work for us to unmute everyone. So I have a couple other questions that came in front of me, but before that, I'm going to unmute participants. If somebody on the call would like to ask a question, please say so and introduce yourself, and you should now have that ability. So is there anyone on the line who wants to ask a question? Going once, going twice? if you do have one, go ahead and chime in a bit. I'm going to go ahead and ask one of the other questions in front of me about what sort of trends we're seeing in the U.S. market. So I guess, Lola, this question is to mean sort of where is growth in storage deployment likely to occur and for what purpose? So maybe if we narrow this down, at the wholesale level, what sort of trends are we seeing in deployment? Are we seeing, do you expect that we'll see deployments driven by a market pull for ancillary services, or there will be a shift to sort of longer duration storage? When you talk to EEI members, what are you hearing from them about where they're looking to go?
We are really seeing a little bit of everything. That goes to the map I was showing before, that different regions are, looking to deploy storage because of different needs that they have at that particular moment. So we're seeing a lot. So again, I think the ancillary services market in PJM, for instance, was very lucrative for many years, so that made perfect sense. So a lot of batteries were deployed for that. It's, again, not my area of expertise, but that market saturated a little bit. So we'll see what happens. I think that the wholesale market drive will really depend on how FERC and the different RTOs solve the rules of the game. How do they end up allowing and compensating these resources for? So I think if the rules are clear, if the rules do allow for comparable treatment, if the rules allow for good cost structure, then we'll see more of that there. But again, let's remember that there's really nothing that energy storage can do that other resources cannot do. So that is a tricky thing for energy storage. I think the biggest benefit is that it can do whatever it does cheaper or more efficiently than other resources. So the rules, whatever happens, that incent the deployment or that allow or that level the playing field, they need to be able to make energy storage more cost-effective at the end of the day than other resources. It's not like wind that provided something different. Energy storage cannot really provide anything different than other resources can. It's really about how they provide that. We're seeing a lot of deployment or interest in deployment at the distribution level, but on the utility side of this, the distribution level, in T&D deferral type of applications, a lot of interest in deploying energy storage to help balance renewable energy, both at the transmission, wholesale, and distribution levels. So we're seeing that as well. So we really are seeing interest all around. We're seeing a lot of interest in microgrids, smaller applications, and despite the newspaper articles, we continue to think that storage at the residential level will probably be too pricey for it to take off in any considerable way. Larger applications, utility applications will continue. We'll always have, like with solar and other distributed resources, we'll always have a cost advantage. So even though we're probably going to see more of that at the behind-the-meter type of applications, we really don't see that taking off, since the numbers don't really add up for that, but there will always be some. But again, on the other ones, I think we're going to see a little bit of everything, or a lot of everything.
Thanks. We have 2 more minutes, so I'm going to pause again and just give our participants an opportunity to vocalize a question. Is there one from anybody on the line? Okay, so with 2 minutes left, I might just ask one final question, which is a little bit of a leading question, but this webinar is for our members, Lola, who are international, and what guidance could you give them about how they can find information and resources to better understand storage applications and what's going on in the industry and specifically what EEI is doing in this space?
Well, that really is a question for you, Daniel, but thank you. So we have some materials that are public or some materials that we could make available to the international members. So there is the paper. We are doing some tracking of policy at the state level, which again, as long as it's not shared outside of membership, I think we can make public. So many of the things that I shared in my presentation, there's products behind it that I think we can share. So I can touch base with you, and then we can see what we have, and you can share those things. We also have a very small, I should say, what I call newsletter, but it's really not a newsletter, which is really once a month we have a list of, the bigger issues, the bigger news clips, essentially, bigger reports or more important reports, conferences, things that are happening in the U.S. during that month when it relates to energy storage. That's also something we can do. And there's a lot of information that is not EEI related on energy storage. There's that database I mentioned by the Department of Energy. There is the Energy Storage Association has a lot of public information on their website as well. And we work very closely with them. We have a lot of same policy interest as of now, so that they have good info. They also have things, but maybe you and I can work on that if the folks on the call want more info.
Yeah, I think the first step for anybody on the call is if you are interested in sort of a deeper dialogue with Lola and others here at EEI on this topic, get in touch with the International Programs team here with your point of contact, and we can sort of see what sort of engagement is would be most useful and what sort of resources we can provide. So, okay. It's 11:02, so I think we'll conclude there. I want to thank you, Lola, for giving us this overview and for walking people through your white paper. What I will send out to all of our participants after the call is a copy of the presentation, and then once we have the recording uploaded, I will also send a link to that as well. So thank you, everyone, for joining from multiple time zones, and we look forward to seeing you at some of our future webinars as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.